Thank you, Robin. Good morning. We are so excited that we're here with you today, talking about data validation, which I know is not an easy topic, right? However, the objectives for our training are very clear today. First of all, we want to make this complex process less complex for you by giving you a method, a practical way in which you can look at data validation for individuals with barriers to employment, that it's less confusing, right? And the second objective for our training this morning is for you to be able to leave that training with practical case management tools, actual forms to help you whenever you're working with a participant or whenever you are reviewing files and you are determining, what I need to validate, when and how. We want to make sure that you leave this training with a clear understanding as to how to do those things and with tools on your tool belt in order to be able to do that. So with all of that said, let's just jump right into it. And our first section of the training is going to be provided by Steven. So Steven, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Rasani. Before we get into the meat and potatoes and dealing with folks with barriers, I wanted to kind of give a little high-level context to data validation and what it is. If you signed up for this webinar, you probably already have a pretty good idea. But odds are, the first thing that comes to mind with data validation is backup documentation. Being able to prove what you say in the system matches reality. And that's definitely a part of it. What we want you to take away from this is it's about data quality. And quality is accuracy. There's also comprehensiveness. When you put information in the system, some folks may think that, it just sits there forever and we just pull out a report here and there when we need it. But what it really does is, we use it to make decisions. We also report it to ETA and the feds, and they use that data to help us set performance goals. So when we have negotiations with the feds on what our performance goal should be, and we say, we're serving hard to serve folks, and they say, well, this report says you only had 5 individuals with barriers, there's a disconnect there. So we want to make sure we're able to report a holistic, a comprehensive picture of who we're serving, what they've done as a participant, and what the outcomes were. And in order to do that, Razani and her team will introduce some additional information to kind of help that process and smooth that out so that we can make sure that we're providing accurate, reliable data, but it's also comprehensive. And also, I wanted to give some additional information because today's session is going to be mostly about individuals with barriers, and a lot of that information is done on the intake eligibility determination side of the life cycle. But also wanted to make sure folks kept in mind that data validation occurs throughout the entire participation period. We need good information, not only on intake and eligibility, but also during a participants' employment plan process, during their assessments, making sure the scores are accurate, and so that we can capture those basic skills levels and do any kind of measurable skills gains that may apply. Service types and dates, those need to be documented well. And also outcomes, making sure that when we say an individual earned a credential, we can prove that. But again, today's discussion is more on helping get a comprehensive picture of who we're serving and kind of helping that process and getting it to where it needs to be. So with that, I'll turn it over to Razani.
Thank you, Stephen. So this training that we're providing you today complements a week that was just released about data validation for individuals with barriers. So some of the information that we're going to be share with you today, you will find on that week. But because data validation is data validation, right? It's a complex process to make sure that what we are gathering is reliable and accurate. We wanted to make sure that we not only provided you with that guidance that we wanted to make sure that in addition to that, we complement the week with this training. So with all of that said, in order for us to have data that is accurate and reliable, that we can feel confident that what we're looking into our system is what we are doing, we need to know three main things. First of all, we need to know the what. What are the data elements that I need to collect? Second, we need to know the how I'm going to verify these elements, right? What are the allowable documents needed in order for me to accurately and reliably validate these data elements? And we need to know the when. And this might sound kind of simple for those of you that have been doing data validation for a long time, but sometimes we just get in the flow of things, and we kind of like forget that we need to make sure that when we are gathering this data, our foundation is strong. And in order for our foundation to be strong, we need to know the elements, the what, we need to know the how, and we need to know the when to collect this data. And as Stephen mentioned, our training today, there's a number of data elements that we have to validate throughout the life of a case for WIOA Title I. And you're going to continue to validate those. And I know that you are validating those. But today's training focused on how to validate these data elements that relates to individuals with barriers to employment, right? And we serve individuals with barriers to employment every day. We serve individuals that might have one barrier or a multiple number of barriers. We serve individuals that come to our doors with barriers that we are very familiar with. For example, we have someone that comes to our door needing a high school equivalency, and we feel comfortable and we know what we need to ask, and we know what kind of like documents we need to require. But we might have individuals coming through our doors that have barriers that are less familiar to us. For example, an English language learner or seasonal worker that we are not accustomed to serve. But regardless of the number of barriers that the individual has, or whether we are familiar with those barriers or not, there's something that will never change. We need to track those barriers, we need to report those barriers, and we need to validate those barriers, and we need to know when to do this. And in order for us to do that with every single person that comes to our program, right, we need to know that these barriers are reported and validated depending upon three main things. First, the unique needs of that individual. Second, how these barriers relate to our eligibility process. And thirdly, how these barriers relate to our priority of service process. So these three elements are very important when we are looking at the barriers that the individual has and how we're gonna validate these barriers. There's not a magic formula that, or like or something universal that we can use with every single person that comes to our doors with barriers to employment, as to how we can, as to like a magic process to validate these data elements. Therefore, we need to really understand, how these barriers relate to our own Title I process in order for this validation to be accurate and reliable. We're going to present to you a way in which you can see these barriers. And I want you to imagine that you have two buckets. The first bucket, we're going to call it reported only. And I'm going to explain what reported only means in a minute. But before that, I want to say that most barriers to employment can be reported only and validated by self-attestation. And you're going to hear me saying that this morning several times. I'm going to break it down, and we're going to be pros at the end of this process. So what reported only means? It means that even though the participant discloses having a barrier or multiple barriers, multiple number of barriers, right? That barrier will not be taken into consideration to determine the eligibility or priority of service for Title I purposes. So when you are serving someone that has a number of barriers, more than likely, some of those barriers are not going to be barriers that you are going to utilize or that are going to help you to determine whether the participant is eligible for WIOA Title I services, or the barriers might not be relevant to priority of service. So for those barriers, we are telling you today that you can put those barriers into the reported only bucket, which means that you only have to track these barriers. You only have to report these barriers, but you do have to report them, right? And then you can validate these barriers with self-attestation. That's our first bucket. So you have someone with multiple barriers. Not all of those barriers are relevant to our eligibility priority of service process. We're going to put those barriers under the reported only bucket, or we're going to identify them as reported only. And we more than likely be able to validate these barriers through self-attestation. Next slide. This slide just says what I just explained you about reported only and self-attestation for those that are not as relevant. Next one. Okay, now let's talk about self-attestation. For those of us that have been in the Title I world for a minute, you're familiar with self-attestation, but it is important for us to take just a few minutes and dive into what self-attestation is and how ETA looks at self-attestation. So self-attestation is when the participant discloses that he or her has a particular status, that has a particular barrier, and then signs and dates a form acknowledging that. A properly signed and dated application in which the participant has disclosed having a barrier is considered self-attestation. So self-attestation is simple. I say, you know, I have a disability, or I'm a pregnant youth, and then I sign and date a form, a self-attestation form, acknowledging that, or I sign and date the application after I check the boxes that says, you know, I have a disability, or I'm a veteran, or whatever barrier the individual is self-disclosing. Now, what makes self-attestation a little bit tricky is how ETA sees self-attestation. So we're telling you that for those barriers that are not relevant to or as relevant to for the eligibility process and priority of service process for Title I individuals, that you can, because you're not using that barrier for the rest of the process, right? Unless, you know, things changes and later you have to address them, but you're not using those barriers for eligibility or priority of service. You can use self-attestation. You can have the individuals check that box on your application, say that that person has a disability, and then sign and date, and you're good. And that's okay. Now, when self-attestation gets tricky is when you are moving forward in this process and you have a barrier that you are going to be utilizing for eligibility purposes. And this is how ETA looks at self-attestation in that instance. And let me tell you that for eligibility and priority of service, self-attestation cannot be used for all elements. It's allowed in some, but it's not allowed in all. Like, you can never use self-attestation for determining low income. That's not allowed. However, there's other instances in which you can use self-attestation for eligibility purposes, but only as your last resort. You cannot say that all of the participants that you're serving, you're determining them eligible based on an element that you're using, or on a data element that you are validating with self-attestation all the time. That won't fly. But there's certain instances, and we're gonna go over a specific example later on in our training, in which you are using that barrier for eligibility purposes. The individual is unable to gather the piece of documentation that says that he or she has that situation. And then in that instance, because there's no way that the individual can gather that piece of documentation, you can use self-attestation. So how ETA sees self-attestation for those barriers that you are going to use for eligibility and priority of service, for those data elements that is allowed, self-attestation for those elements should be your last resort. But they say that the lack of documentation should never be a barrier for someone to access our services. So I know self-attestation can be a little tricky, but what I want you to remember right now is that for reporting only barriers that you are not using for eligibility because you have other barriers that are more relevant for eligibility, self-attestation is good. We're letting you know that you can use self-attestation to report only for those barriers that you're putting in that bucket. So now we talked about reported only, and we talked about self-attestation. Let's have some poll questions and see how we're doing today. Okay, first poll question. What does reported only means? It means a new process to validate all data elements through self-attestation. It means a method to identify the participant barriers not relevant, or it means a new way for not gathering additional documentation. We have about 30 seconds to complete this first poll question. I forgot to say, we want this to be interactive, so I might be asking you to type some things in the chat, and we have several poll questions throughout the training. Okay, we have about 50% of our participants already responded. So yes, for those of you that selected number 2, reported only is a method to just to report those barriers that are not relevant to the eligibility process and validate them through we can validate them through self-attestation. That's great. Now we are going to go to poll question number 2. Okay, what does self-attestation means? Participant disclosure of a status for a particular data element. I'm sorry, I can't read all of the Robin or Andrea, can you read all of the statements, because I can't see them completely.
Yeah, I can read that for you. So the question is, what does self-attestation mean? Participant disclosure of a status for a particular data element. Participant written disclosure of a status for a particular data element, or participant disclosure of a status for a particular data element that is dated and signed by the participant.
Thank you. And I think this was an easy one. And yes, it's that the participant discloses a status for a particular data element, but what makes it a complete self-attestation is when they sign it and they date it. So you can have that checkbox in your application checked, but if that application is not signed and dated by the participant, then it's not going to be a correct self-attestation. Or you can have a self-attestation form as part of your intake packet, but if that participant doesn't sign it and date it, it's not an appropriate self-attestation. So self-attestation happens when they disclose to that data element, and then you have your signature and the date on that application or form. This is just a summary, right? For reported purposes only, we are using self-attestation for those barriers that are not as relevant to the eligibility purpose or priority of service determination. Next one. So let's walk through this scenario through an example. So And now I'm going to ask you to write in the chat, and if I get some help looking at what we are the answers that we are getting. So the example is an adult with disability or disabilities who receives food stamps. What are my two barriers here? Who can tell me what are my two barriers here? In the chat box. Disability and low income. Perfect. Yes, those are the two barriers. Now, what barrier I need to report only? And we already provided you with the answer there. Yes, the disability, because disability doesn't affect the eligibility process, and it does not affect the priority determination process. So the barrier that I am going to report only is the disability status. Hopefully that's clear, right? It's not relevant to eligibility, it's not relevant to priority of service. And how I'm going to validate this reported only barrier. Can you guys write that in the chat? What is it that I'm going to use? The sign and the date application, but it's missing something. What else? So in order, I don't need to, someone wrote the disability documentation. I would ask for medical records if I would be using these disability barrier for my eligibility purposes. But because I am not using it for eligibility purposes, I am reporting it only. And because I am reporting that barrier only, I don't have to worry about gathering confidential information right now. I can do it through self-attestation. And then self-attestation is that signed and dated application with the data element check, right? So right now, for those of you that work as a case manager, see people or review cases, right? Right now, we're telling you that if the case manager or whoever is making the eligibility determination is not using disability as one of the barriers for eligibility, you don't have to worry about gathering any more additional information, right? You make sure that in your application, you have those boxes, right, for the individuals to check. Once they check those boxes, if you have that signature and you have the date on that application, you are good to go. You report this individual as having a disability, and then in our system, you report it and you validate it, or you validate that data element through self-attestation. Excellent. Next slide. Okay. Now, we've been talking about the barriers and data elements that we are going to be putting in our reported only bucket, right? Now we're going to move to our other bucket. So we will report only those barriers into the report only bucket. We're going to place them there only when they are not relevant for the priority of service and eligibility process. Now, the other barriers that are relevant to the eligibility process and to the priority of service, we need to put those barriers in the bucket in which you're going to gather additional information, right? Because you're using that for determining that individual either eligible and in priority of service or eligible or priority of service. So those barriers are relevant. Therefore, you have to do, the process is a little bit different. You have to gather documentation in this instance. But in order to classify the barriers that you have in front of you, either for report only purposes or for eligibility, priority of service purposes, you need to ask yourself certain questions. So I am going to put the barriers in this bucket for eligibility and priority of service after I ask myself 3 main questions. First one, is a barrier within the priority of service category? If the barrier that I'm reviewing right now for this participant within the priority category priority of service category, meaning is the barrier an example of the individual being a recipient of public assistance, or low-income individual, or basic skills sufficient individual, or veteran status, right? That's my first question. The second question, will the barrier make the participant financially eligible? Meaning, will the barrier prove that the participant is low income or receive SSI or TANF or food stamps, right? And the third question that I'm going to ask myself is, what barriers could Title I services help the individual overcome? What is it that the individual is asking? What services the individual is asking for? Do I really have to worry about eligibility determination when the individual is asking for services that don't need financially eligibility, for example, right? So the three questions that I need to ask are, if the barrier relevant to priority of service is relevant to eligibility, financial eligibility, or is the barrier relevant to, what kind of services the individual is asking for, like how the barriers relate to the services that he or she is asking for. So if any if the barriers are relevant to priority of service, and if the barrier is the barrier relevant to financial eligibility or eligibility period, then I'm going to put those barriers on this side, and then meaning that I'm going to have to gather documentation for those barriers. Next slide. Okay, so let's take the same example that we just discussed. We're making it easy here. I know real life is not as easy. I was a case manager for some time, so I know it's difficult. So we have an adult with disability who receives food stamp. What barrier or barriers is more relevant to the eligibility or priority of service? Put it in the chat. What barrier is, out of my two barriers, disability, food stamps? Yes, this is kind of easy, right? Food stamps, because if you receive food stamps, you're automatically financially eligible. You're considered low income. And this barrier actually hits both indicators, right? It tells you that the individual is financially eligible, and it also places that individual in the priority of service category, right? So how can I validate the barrier? How can I validate the barrier? What kind of documentation? Yes, I see that coming through the chat already. SNAP letter. Yes, you validate this barrier with a number of documents. For example, here I have proof of food stamp. That could be that SNAP letter, right? The good thing is that we have created a low income checklist for you as part of this training and as part of the week. So we're going to go over that checklist later, but we have created a tool that you can take with you, that you can look at the barriers that you have, that participant has, that you are reviewing right now, and then immediately you can see the list of allowable documents that you can use in order to validate that data. Because as I said at the beginning, we want you to leave this training with practical tools that you can use on your day-to-day. Okay, so excellent answers from the chat. So for this particular example, the disability, we took care of that pretty much at intake, right? Because the person disclosed, we got that disclosure through the application, we have the signature and the date, and we don't have to worry about anything else. And then we will use the other barrier that we have that allow us to determine eligibility, and we already know the documents that we can use in order to validate that. So I hope that this way of looking at barriers, it's making it less complicated to go through the validation process. Okay, next slide, please. Now I am going to stop talking about theory, and we're going to put it into practice. We want you to have the opportunity to walk this information that I just shared with you. We want you to walk it through specific examples so you can see how it looks like with these scenarios. And now I am going to ask Kim to share our first scenario with us. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. As Rosani said, there will be a lot more poll questions in this training, and Michelle and I will alternate between 4 different scenarios. Okay, the first one, the participant is a veteran that receives food stamps and has a disability. And we can get to the first poll question. What barriers are more relevant for the eligibility and/or priority process of this participant? Veteran and disability status, disability and veteran status, public assistant, food stamps, and veteran status. Okay, for those of you that chose public assistance and vet status, that is the correct answer. These barriers place them at the top of the priority list. The disability barrier, however, does not place them in a priority of service category, nor makes them financially eligible. So that status is only reported. Okay, we can go ahead and go to poll question 2. What barriers do I have to validate with supporting documentation? Public assistance status, veteran and public assistance status, or disability status? So the correct answer in this scenario is the veteran status and public assistance status. Both of these are validated with proper documentation, with one of those being the DD-214, or any other relevant documentation that Rosani expressed will be outlined in that individuals with barriers checklist, and then the proof of the food stamps. And I will pass it on to Michelle to go over scenario 2 with you all.
Thank you, Kim. In this scenario, the participant is 16 years old and not attending school. They have no high school diploma or recognized high school equivalency credential. Now for our first poll question. What barriers are most relevant for the eligibility process of this participant? High school dropout, not attending school, no high school equivalency credential, or not attending school and not high school equivalency credential. Andrea, my screen stopped at 36%. Are we still answering?
Yeah, I think the poll stopped for some reason. Yeah, so it ended.
It ended? Okay. But for this question, we have 54% have answered high school dropout, not attending school, which is the correct answer. The barrier of high school dropout, not attending school, is the most relevant barrier for eligibility purposes. This barrier makes the youth eligible for the Title I services as an out-of-school youth participant. That barrier of needing a high school equivalency credential by itself does not make the participant eligible for Title I services, however. I will note, in this scenario, the out-of-school youth is considered automatically financially eligible. We'll move on to poll question 2. What barriers do I have to validate with supporting documentation? Yes, the correct answer. You should validate with documentation for high school dropout, not attending school. As an example, self-attestation, school attendance records, school letters, identifying truancy, and any other written documentation and verification from the school district. The barrier of needing a high school equivalency credential by itself does not make the participant eligible for Title I services, nor need to be validated. But I will pause there for a moment and point out that you will notice that self-attestation is emboldened. And it is because the records may not be easily obtainable from the school, such as the proof of truancy, transcripts, etc. And so the priority of service and financial eligibility has already been established as a high school dropout and not attending school under out-of-school youth priority. So in this case, the self-attestation is acceptable. And now I'll pass the presentation back to Kim, who will move forward.
Thank you.
Number 3.
All right, scenario 3. The participant is a veteran with an honorable discharge and was recently released from probation. And we can go into the first poll question. What barriers are more relevant for the eligibility process of this participant? Justice involved, veteran status and justice involved, or veteran status with honorable discharge? So in this scenario, the correct answer is veteran status and the honorable discharge. Both the veteran status and discharge type in this scenario place them in a priority category. The justice involvement does not afford them priority or make them financially eligible. I know this might make you all think, how can a veteran have an honorable discharge if they were justice involved? But in this scenario, the veteran did not commit an infraction during their military time. They committed it once they exited the military. And we can go to poll question 2. What barriers do I have to validate with supporting documentation? Veteran status, justice involved status, veteran status, and honorable discharge. So the correct answer is veteran status and discharge status. The discharge status is validated using the DD-214 typically. The other documents are outlined in that other checklist that Rosani spoke about earlier in the presentation. And it's important to note that even with a dishonorable discharge, a veteran can still receive priority, they will not see priority of service, but they can still receive WIOA services, but not on a priority basis. It's the honorable status on that DD-214 document that affords them that priority of service. And then I think we have one more scenario, so I'll pass it back to Michelle.
Thank you, Kim. And in this 4th scenario, the participant is a justice-involved adult individual, otherwise referred to as an ex-offender, who is also homeless and receives food stamps. We'll give you all time to answer that.
Yes.
Interesting. The correct answer was the 3rd barrier of SNAP recipient addresses 2 areas. First, because it places this individual in the priority list for WIOA services as it fulfills the low income criteria. And 2, because it makes him automatically financially eligible. The second barrier, being homeless individual when supported with valid documentation, such as shelter documentation, would serve as an indication of low income status. The first barrier, a justice-involved individual, is not relevant to the Title I eligibility and or priority of service. Both of these barriers need to be reported only. And I'll point out that once the priority of status and financial eligibility are established, this documentation is no longer necessary for establishing homelessness and justice involved. So that would just be simply extra documentation. We'll move on to our second poll question. What barriers do I have to validate with supporting documentation? The correct answer was SNAP recipient. I can understand choosing homeless and SNAP recipient, but the correct answer is the SNAP recipient. You should validate with documentation for SNAP recipient with items such as proof of food stamps, EBT card, SNAP letter, etc. The justice involved in homelessness barriers need to be reported only and validated through self-attestation. And I'll bring you back to the first question, the answer for the first question, which is self-attestation is the first choice of documentation in these cases because the priority of status and financial eligibility have already been established. And obtaining the documentation for these areas of barriers can pose as an additional barrier and delay in service in trying to obtain them. So I have concluded this and now we'll pass it back to Kim, who will address population with barriers to employment.
Thank you so much. I was getting ready to speak on mute. But job seekers face an array of barriers to employment with populations that we do frequently interact with, such as individuals with disabilities, veterans, and youth. However, WIOA also encompasses other populations local areas may not interact with as frequently, such as migrant workers, individuals who are justice involved, and those facing substantial cultural barriers. And they're all listed here on this slide. And local workforce boards can also determine what other groups may have barriers to employment to provide the most comprehensive job seeker services. And with that being said, I will hand it back over to Rosani.
Thank you, Kim. So before I jump into the checklist, and we'll do that in a minute, I just wanted to make sure that that the practical scenarios are clear, in the sense that we're asking you to look at these barriers a little bit different, right? And we're asking you to make the determination as to which ones you need to just report with self-attestation and which ones you need in order to determine eligibility and gather additional information. So the example of that youth, out of school youth, that was not able to find the paperwork from the school is a prime example when you are using a barrier to determine eligibility, right? But that individual is not able to find that piece of documentation. And in that instance, because in that specific data element, you can use self-attestation, you can allow that individual to use self-attestation, and that will be okay. That's one of those instances that you're using self-attestation as the last resort in order to validate the data that you need to validate in order to determine eligibility for that participant, right? So, and for the last example, yes, you could go ahead and gather those additional information, those additional documentations for homelessness. But why would you do that when you already have, like Michelle mentioned, right? You already have that data with the barrier of food stamps that kind of hits both areas, right? The priority list and priority category and eligibility. So we're trying for you to start thinking about, you know, the data elements and what you are gathering in a different way. If you don't need it because another data element fulfills the requirements for eligibility and priority of service, do not gather it, right? The same thing as we explained with the disability. So we want you to think about the barriers that you have in front of you and determine which ones you can just report only and which ones you can move forward, right? That's kind of like the paradigm shift that we are presenting to you today. And don't worry, this is backed up with a wig, so you can have the wig to go back and reference. And it's also supported by these checklists that we have created for you. And actually we created 2 checklists. If we go to the next slide, the first checklist, although you can see it here, but you have these attachments as part of the wig, and you will have this information as part of this training as well, is a checklist for individuals with barriers to employment. What is it that we did here? We took all of the barriers within our legislation that had to do with barriers to employment, right? All of the data elements that had to do with barriers to employment. And we put them in this one form for you. On the right side column, you have the barriers, and on the left side column, you have the list of the documents that you need in order to first report only the barrier, and you know what that means now, right? Because that barrier, you won't utilize it for eligibility or priority of service. Or if you're using that barrier for eligibility, then you have a way to check the word eligibility and then check whatever document out of that list you are gathering. Why? We want you to feel confident when you are reviewing this documentation, when you're reviewing these applications, or when you're talking to the individual, the participant, and you have that participant in front of you, to make sure that you gather all the information that you need to gather. And later, if you have to review that again and see that you have everything that you need, or determine which ones you don't need any more information, you can have something at hand that you can reference to and you can use. We want this to be a practical tool for you, for you to use in your everyday work. So that's the first checklist. And you have all of the, main barriers here to employment. The other checklist, which is the next slide, is a checklist that only talks about low income. Why? Low income is it's a barrier that has a lot of data elements in itself. And the checklist starts with a general definition for low income, and then you'll see your youth definition for low income as well. So you can have a quick reference if you want to make sure that something you clarify something quickly, you can just reference that in that checklist, and then it moves to each data element under low income under that element, and then the same as the other checklist on your right hand. I'm sorry, I'm saying it incorrectly. On your left hand column, you have the actual data element, and then on your right hand column, you have the forms that you can use to validate that particular data element under low income. Remember, for low income, there's no self-attestation, right? So you have these two tools, case management tools. The third tool that we have created for you is a frequently asked question tool. And we receive a lot of TAs, our team receive a lot of TAs on an ongoing basis. So we have put in this one document, most like those TA questions that we receive the most that could become confusing for you guys. And we have grouped these TA questions under one topic. For example, you have your disability questions, and then you have veteran related questions, youth related questions, ex-offender or justice involved related questions, and just general questions to help you on your day-to-day decision making that you have to make when you're serving these participants, or when you're training your staff, or when you are reviewing these cases. We want to make sure that you leave this training with tools that you can use beyond the training. And with that, that concludes our training report out piece of this process. And now we're going to have our Q&A segment. So Robin, I give it back to you.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, everyone. A lot of information. So we had a lot of questions that actually came through the chat box. What I'd like to do, if the panelists agree, is go through some of those questions and answers so that everybody can benefit. But in the meantime, if you think of additional questions, if you would please enter them in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand icon. We'll turn on your microphone and then you can verbally ask a question. So looking back at the checkbox, so there was a question about, does the Social Security card need to be signed? And the answer was, as long as the card can be tied to the individual, it will work. Do we need to address that any more than what it says?
Stephen, I think that will be for you.
Yeah.
I was just saying, as long as you can, it's got the person's name on it, and that was the name they gave. It's their card. Then yeah, it doesn't need to be signed to be valid now.
Okay. And there was a question about from a new employee, and they wanted to know about Title I. What does that mean? So the answer, Brittany Walsh responded to that. Good question, Pamela. WIOA contains 5 titles, which are administered by various partner organizations. Title I covers the workforce development activities, which includes job training and related services to unemployed or underemployed individuals, and establishes the governance and performance accountability system for WIOA. Title II, Adult Ed, Title III, Wagner-Pizer, Title IV, amendments to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Title V, general provisions regarding transition from WIA to WIOA. So, for those who need that information or a refresher, do we need to address that anymore? Okay. We had a comment, to be clear on self-attestation for a disability barrier. For example, on an application, the individual marks they are pregnant or have a medical barrier. It's acceptable to be marked on the application. However, if this information does affect eligibility, no documentation is necessary. So that was just a comment that somebody made. And following up to self-attestation to a medical barrier, if there is no documentation to validate this, do you not enter this information in the portal? And I can go back over that if you want me to.
Okay, so let me take the disability example, right? So if someone self-discloses having a disability, they check that box and they sign and date the application. That's great. That's what you need to have if you're not using that barrier for eligibility purposes. But now let's change the scenario from an adult to a youth with disabilities, right? You have an in-school youth that you're serving, he's going to school, that meets the financial eligibility portion of our process. However, that youth doesn't have any other barrier besides disability. In that instance, you need to have a barrier in order to determine that in-school youth eligible for our services, right? That means that you are using that disability barrier as your barrier to determine eligibility. And in that instance, you change the disability from the reported only bucket to the bucket for eligibility. And once I do that, I need to gather documentation, right? If I'm using the disability for eligibility purposes, because that's the only barrier this youth, in-school youth has, then I will have to gather documentation for that. But if they're just reporting to you that they have a disability, and you don't need that for anything else, then self-attestation is good. You know, you can use self-attestation through the checkbox for pregnant youth. They can sign and take the application. That will be fine. For ex-offender or justice involved, that will be fine. As long as you don't using that, as long as you're not using that for eligibility purposes. The same thing with homelessness, right? If homelessness is the only barrier that you have that is going to help you to determine that person low income, because by statute, if you're homeless, you're low income, then you should try your very, very best to get documentation from the shelter, from a social worker, from some of the allowable documents that we have in that list for you. So hopefully that, clarifies that.
Okay, Lisa Lane, excuse me, has a question. I'll let her ask her question verbally.
Yes.
Let me make sure.
Hi, Lisa.
Get you unmuted.
She's not out. She's not unmuted.
Yeah. Lisa, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you for allowing me to ask a question.
Can you start over? The audio is breaking up really bad.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry. Try to turn it up just a little bit. Can you hear me now?
I think we are able to hear you. Can you, I know I've been pushing everybody to the Q&A box, but in case you have a question to what Rosanna was just speaking to, would you please enter it in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. I'll just type the question in.
Okay, thank you.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, just bad connection there. All right. Okay, I guess what we could do is, while she's entering that question, let me start to address some of the open questions in the Q&A box. The first one is, for a self-attestation medical barrier, in parentheses, doesn't affect eligibility, do you still key this information in the portal? Not sure if you already addressed that.
Yeah, no, if you're using self-attestation to validate the barrier, because you're only reporting the barrier, do not keep medical records, because you're not using them for eligibility, right? So, and then you're carrying PII, confidential information in the records that you're not using. There's no reason for you to have there. So if the person is disclosing having a medical condition, a disability, a medical condition, right? Just the checkbox or the statement saying, you know, I have a medical condition and the signature and the date. They don't have to go into details because you're not really needing that information.
I just want to clarify for my purposes, though, when she says key it in, does that mean, you know, indicate in the system whatsoever? We do want you to check the box saying that they have a disability. You just don't have to back that up with anything if it's not impacting their eligibility. Just want to make sure that's clear. We want y'all to report as much as is actually the case. My point in the beginning was, you know, the feds will tweak our performance based on if we're serving hard to serve populations, but if we can't prove or we're not reporting that we're serving these individuals, they're not going to cut us that slack. And there's, you know, policy decisions made on this type of information, so we need to collect this information. It's just if it's not impacting eligibility or priority, we're not going to put the onus on getting all this backup documentation. Now, if somebody comes in well prepared and you know has a bunch of these documents already ready to go, and all you got to do is scan them in, and if you want to collect them, please do. But the requirement kind of stops at the eligibility priority, step.
Yes, we want you to track that.
Okay, we have another question. Let's see, from Lisa Lane. She has a question regarding the EBT card as a form of supporting documents. Is this acceptable? Is this an acceptable form of documentation? Is this an acceptable form of documentation? The EBT card.
So there's a couple of questions that are kind of, hey, does this count as a backup discount? There's a couple of resources that are already out there. Teagle 2319 attachment 2 has a very comprehensive list of every data element that we report and what's acceptable documentation to back that up. I think Daryl had a question about high school dropouts and whatnot. And there's also the checklist that Rasani put together also will tell you for each of these eligibility or barrier populations what the acceptable documentation is. I don't see the EBT card is not listed, and we are not allowed to expand on the federal guidance. We can't add documents to their list. So if it's not on that Teagle 2319 attachment 2, we're not allowed to include it.
And I just want to say that we created that checklist based on that Teagle. So if it's not there, more than likely, if it's not in the checklist, more than likely it's not. But you are always welcome to cross-reference that with the actual Teagle. But yeah, you will have like a tool that tells you what's accepted and what's not for you to use when you're working the cases or working with the participants.
Okay, next question from Daryl Stillings. If a youth is a high school dropout or have a documented learning disability through school record, is a Tabe test or another type of assessment necessary to determine basic skills deficient for data validation, or could school records suffice?
Again, there's another, I think it's element 804 on that Teagle attachment. But just to answer the question, school records would count as long as it speaks to the student's situation. So you don't have to have a test as long as you have some sort of school records as well. But again, if you have questions like this, like does this count or does this apply? that Teagle attachment 2 is a very useful document.
Okay, next question from Ruth Alvarez Moon. Can you please share how detailed the food statement needs to be? Does it need to include all family individuals as well?
Food stamps, in order to validate foods, like food stamps you use in order to validate low income, the only way in which you can validate that is with actual documentation that comes from like their SNAP letter or something official like that. So in the checklist, low income checklist, you will have a list of documents, as well as on the Teagle that Stephen referenced. You will have 2319, I think it's a Teagle, right, Stephen? That you will have the specific list of documents that you can use. But anything that has to do with low income, just you can't use self-attestation. I don't know if that was, you know, the question, but you can only use specific forms, and the list of the forms that you can use is on the checklist that we created for this training, and it's on that Teagle.
Right, it's 2319, and the document list is attachment 2 of that Teagle.
Okay, we have a raised hand from Brandy Logan. Brandy, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to type it in for another question, but it was actually going back to the OSY question for the basic skills deficiency. If we can counter back to that, is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so we came across this because I actually come from adult ed, coming here into OWD. And for OSY students in regards to 16 and 17 years old, they have to have a withdrawal form proving that they're properly withdrawn from any kind of public or homeschooling setting. And I know that we can take self-attestation. Does that contradict the documentation that has to be taken up by adult ed TCSG? And is this something that, I know that we have, it's something that we collect as the self-attestation, but is there any complications to that if it were a 16-year-old still in a homeschool setting or a public school setting and we took that as document? Does that question make sense?
So I'm gonna address the issue from the access standpoint, and Stephen, you might address it like from the data validation standpoint, but from the access standpoint, right? When you have a student that is a dropout, right, that he's not attending school, but he is within that school compulsory attendance age range, right? So what we are saying is that sometimes it's hard for the students to get this documentation from the school system. Sometimes it's hard for the students that they drop out, they just, you know, disconnected from the system. They don't care about gathering this documentation, but they come back after a year and they say, you know, I couldn't make it to school. It was too difficult for me, but I wanna move forward. I wanna get my high school equivalency. But there's no way for that student to get those records. Sometimes the school doesn't want to release them, and sometimes, you know, they don't have the records. So according to our federal guidance for that particular data element, we can use self-attestation, right? You can always ask the student if they have documentation, but what ETA doesn't want to happen is that we turn that student, we deny that student access based on the fact that that student was not able to get that letter from the school needing the service. In that instance, if the student doesn't have that supported documentation and is not able to get it through, you know, the school and the system, and it doesn't have it in the records, the feds has allowed us the opportunity for that instance to use self-attestation in order to provide access for that participant or for that person into Title I services. So their self-attestation is used for access more than anything else because it's hard for that student to get those documents.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's been, I just wanted to clarify because it was something that I'd never seen until coming here, which is great.
Okay. I don't know, Stephen, if you want to add something.
I just want to say, I think also on the checklist, make sure that, you know, not all elements allow for self-attestation to appear. Make sure that self-attestation is one of the allowable forms of documentation before jumping into just saying, oh, yeah, sign this application and you're done. And also, if you are going to report, say, a basic skills assessment, you will need those documentations of those scores and whatnot. You can't just say, oh yeah, they scored a 900. Like, we would need hard copies of things that you would report like that on but that's outside the scope of this this topic.
Thank you.
Okay, we're ready to move on to the next question from Lisa Lane. Regarding records maintenance for a disability, would we keep the supporting docs and the signed application disclosing the disability in a separate location?
So the question will be, so if you have an application that just says disability, right? Or sometimes, our own system asks for the disability type, mental, physical, but it doesn't go beyond anything else. You're not really gathering the specific diagnosis with, any more than just saying that, the check of that disability, the signature and the date. You can keep that in your records. What you have to be careful of is when you have documentation that speaks specifically of that individual's condition, right? It goes beyond a general cluster of disability types, and it goes into a specific diagnosis, into progress notes from the doctor, something that is more specific. Anything that is specific to that individual beyond just checking a disability status or a general disability type, then has to be kept separately in a confidential case file, logged. How we, you got to follow the process that we have in the policy. And one thing that I want to say, part of this TIGO that we just released talks about how to storage confidential information, how to discard confidential information. And the TIGO goes into, more in depth as to what to do with confidential information. And we are contemplating doing, a second training that just focus on what do you do with confidential information, because I know that can be confusing sometimes. So, but for the purpose of this training and time and all of it, we just focus on the data validation and the reported option versus, what you need to do for those that you're using for eligibility purposes in terms of the barriers, right? Data elements. But we have specific guidance in our policy that talks about, what to do with confidential information. And then the TIGO also addresses that.
Okay. The next, it looks like from Ruth Alvarez Moon, and I might be wrong, that she's addressing that question as well, saying per auditors, medical related documents should be maintained in a confidential file that is accessible if asked by an auditor, but it should not be uploaded to the VOS file. It's more of a statement than a question.
Okay.
Let's see. back up to Lisa Lane had a question regarding records maintenance for a disability. Would we keep the supporting docs and the signed application disclosing the disability in a separate location? I'm sorry, we already covered that one. From Latanya Goodwin, please discuss disability documentation as it relates to our current policy, as it relates to the HIPAA Privacy Act.
So that's kind of like similar question as what we just explained. So Latanya, if it's specific to that participant and it has descriptions, diagnosis, you know, anything beyond just disability, yes, no, or disability type, Robin, she has her hand up.
Okay.
Latanya.
Okay, Latanya, can you, let's see, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Got it. Thanks. Good morning. And this is a great webinar, and I truly appreciate you guys putting it on. The question that I have, you did answer in detail with Lisa Lane, but I also want to, because a couple of years ago during the monitoring process, I know one of our workforce areas, you know, they, even with the participant self-attestating that they have a disability by check marking it, that they have a disability, and it was part of the application, that area was given a finding because of that check mark. And that's what I was concerned about. And this was not used for eligibility purposes at all. That was not the determination, as far as I know. And I just want to make sure from a monitoring standpoint, because we've been going back in and even redacting that piece of it, you know, so that won't be, you know, that no one won't see it. It is okay to have that self-attestation that they have a disability or need ticket to work on that application. I just want to be clear from a monitoring standpoint.
Brittany Walsh is here on the training as well, but I'm gonna just tell you, if it's just the check box saying disability, you're not really, there's no specific, Robin, can you unmute Brittany? There's no specific confidential information being released, right? So from my standpoint, I see no problem with it. But Brittany, do you want to share light on Latanya's question?
Sure. Sorry. Okay. I think I'm unmuted now. Latanya, I think the year that you're referencing is the year that we ended up removing that finding because exactly the reason that you stated. We were a little unclear. We were unclear in our guidance to you all about what needed to be included, what you could check, what you couldn't check. So we actually removed those findings retroactively for that year. It didn't count against y'all, you know, like in your risk assessment for the next year. But what Rosani has stated today, this guidance is what all of our teams abide by now. So when the programs team comes out to monitor, you know, if we do encounter those issues, this is what we'll be going by now. So I do apologize for the confusion in the past. I think we've got it squared away now, but my apologies for that.
Oh, no worries. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good deal.
Thank you, Brittany.
Okay. It did have in the open questions, I think it's something that was addressed earlier. So a comment from Christy Freeman. Mr. D, I think the school dropout and lack of credential would suffice as BSD 2. And that's something that we addressed earlier. I just didn't want to overlook it.
Stephen,
she said for an OSY.
Can you read the question again?
Well, it was a comment.
I think she's answering
Daryl's. Is it
Daryl's question?
Yeah. Okay. So we're good on that one. All right. That's all that I see as far as questions. Any other questions that you want to address at this point? Seeing none or raising your hand? Okay. Well, then thank you, everyone. This has been very informative. This concludes our webinar for today. We will be sending out a link with a recording of today's webinar, along with the additional resources within a week. Let's see. Thank you for participating in today's webinar, and we hope that you have a wonderful day